I'm Clara Benson, 28 years old, and until 3 months ago, I thought the vintage emerald engagement ring from my fiancé Ethan was the most beautiful symbol of our love. Not because it was flashy, it wasn't, but because of what it represented, the careful thought he put into choosing something that spoke to my soul, rather than my social media feed. Then my younger sister Sophie called it fake at our family dinner, setting off a chain reaction that would end with her facing Ethan's legal team in the most humiliating moment of her entitled life. The look on her face that day when the truth finally came out was something I'll never forget. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I grew up in a typical middle-class family in suburban Massachusetts, where my parents weren't wealthy, but they emphasized the importance of education and hard work over everything else. My father worked as a high school mathematics teacher, and my mother was a nurse at the local hospital. And they scraped together enough to ensure my sister Sophie and I had everything we needed, even though luxury items were rare in our household. From an early age, I learned the value of working for what I wanted, taking on babysitting jobs and helping neighbors with yard work to save up for the things my friends' parents bought without thinking twice about the cost. When I was accepted to Boston University on a partial scholarship, I still had to work 2 part-time jobs to cover the remaining tuition and expenses, spending mornings at a coffee shop near campus and afternoons in classes and evenings shelving books at the university library. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Weekends were divided between studying and picking up extra shifts wherever I could find them, and it was exhausting, but I graduated with minimal debt and a sense of self-reliance that would serve me well in everything that followed. Sophie, 2 years younger than me, took a completely different approach to life from the very beginning. While I embraced our parents' pragmatic values, she seemed determined to escape what she called our boring middle-class existence, spending hours flipping through fashion magazines and creating vision boards of luxury lifestyles and talking endlessly about the wealthy husband she would eventually find to rescue her from what she saw as the drudgery of actual work. Where I saw value in earning my way through dedication and persistence, Sophie saw shortcuts through strategic relationships and charm, always asking me why I worked so hard when I could just marry someone who already had money. After college, I landed an entry-level position at Beacon Marketing Solutions, a growing digital marketing firm where the pay wasn't impressive, but I could see potential for growth if I was willing to put in the effort. I arrived early and stayed late and volunteered for projects nobody else wanted, and within 3 years, I'd been promoted twice and was leading my own team of account managers. By 27, I'd become the youngest director in the company's history, overseeing major campaigns for tech startups and established corporations with a team of 15 people reporting directly to me. Sophie, meanwhile, had dropped out of college halfway through her sophomore year to pursue what she called opportunities in Los Angeles, and from what I gathered through her carefully curated Instagram posts and occasional calls home, these opportunities mainly involved attending industry parties, dating minor celebrities, and working odd jobs that put her adjacent to wealth and influence, without requiring any actual skills or commitment. She would call me with stories about the mansions she had visited or the hedge fund manager who'd bought her dinner, always with an undercurrent of superiority that suggested her life was more exciting and meaningful than my steady climb up the corporate ladder. My dating life during those years was a series of disappointing encounters with men who initially seemed interested in my ambition and intelligence, only to disappear when they realized I wouldn't dim my professional goals to make them feel more important or successful. One boyfriend actually told me it was intimidating dating someone who made more money than he did. And we broke up the next day because I refused to apologize for my success or pretend to be less capable than I was. I had almost resigned myself to focusing solely on my career when I met Ethan at the annual New England Tech Innovation Summit, where I was representing my company on a panel about digital marketing strategies for emerging technologies. During the question and answer session, he asked the most insightful question I'd heard all day about the ethical implications of data collection in targeted advertising.
And afterward, he approached me to continue the conversation, and we ended up talking for hours at the hotel bar about everything from artificial intelligence to environmental sustainability. Ethan introduced himself as the founder of a cybersecurity consulting firm, and he was intelligent and thoughtful and refreshingly humble in a way that made me want to know more about him. When he asked for my number, I gave it without hesitation, and he called the next day to invite me to dinner at a casual neighborhood restaurant that was nice, but not extravagant. He picked me up in a modest BMW sedan rather than the flashy sports car I'd come to expect from successful men in tech. And throughout dinner, he asked questions about my work and my ideas and my goals, and actually listened to my answers with genuine interest. Our second date was at a small art gallery featuring local artists, followed by coffee at a hole-in-the-wall cafe he loved. And our third was a hike on a trail overlooking the Boston Harbor, where we had a picnic with food he had prepared himself. Each time we met, I found myself more drawn to his genuine nature and the way he seemed completely comfortable in his own skin without needing to prove anything to anyone or impress me with expensive gestures that felt hollow and performative. We'd been dating for nearly 2 months when I came across his name in Forbes magazine while flipping through it in a waiting room. There was a feature on tech entrepreneurs under 40, and there was Ethan, listed as the founder and CEO of Sentinel Security Systems, a company valued at over $3 billion, according to the article. The piece mentioned his revolutionary approach to cybersecurity that had earned him contracts with major governments and Fortune 500 companies worldwide. And suddenly, his modest lifestyle and careful approach to revealing personal information made perfect sense. That night, at dinner, I placed the magazine on the table between us and asked him if he had been planning to mention his actual net worth at some point in our relationship. Ethan looked genuinely embarrassed and apologized for not being more forthcoming about his financial situation, explaining that when people knew about his wealth up front, it changed everything about how they treated him. He told me about his last 3 relationships with women who seemed more interested in his bank account than his personality, and how he had wanted to be
Just Ethan with me, rather than Ethan, the billionaire CEO, just the guy who was blown away by my brilliant mind at that conference. His explanation made perfect sense, and I appreciated his desire for authenticity in a world where so many people led with their accomplishments or their assets rather than their actual character. From that point forward, our relationship deepened as we discovered shared values around education and using technology for positive social impact, and the belief that wealth. 6 months later, Ethan proposed during a quiet weekend at his family's cabin in Vermont, presenting me with a vintage emerald ring that had belonged to his grandmother and had been in his family for 3 generations. The ring wasn't massive or obviously expensive, but it was absolutely beautiful in its understated elegance, with a deep green emerald surrounded by small diamonds in an Art Deco setting that spoke to careful craftsmanship and timeless style rather than flashy ostentation. "It's perfect," I told him as he slipped it onto my finger, and I meant it completely, because the ring represented everything I valued about our relationship: authenticity over appearance, substance over spectacle, genuine love over material display. When I called my parents to share the news, they were thrilled, and when I showed them the ring during dinner the following weekend, they admired its classic beauty and the obvious thought Ethan had put into choosing something so meaningful. The problem came when Sophie arrived home for her monthly visit, sweeping into our parents' modest dining room like she was gracing us with her presence after another exhausting month of networking events and yacht parties in Los Angeles. She'd brought her latest boyfriend, Damian Cross, a real estate developer who specialized in luxury properties and drove a red Ferrari that he'd parked prominently in our parents' driveway where all the neighbors could see it. "So let me see this famous engagement ring," Sophie announced before she'd even taken off her designer coat, extending her hand expectantly as if I was a shop clerk presenting merchandise for her inspection. I held out my hand proudly, expecting her to admire the vintage setting or comment on how well it suited my personal style, but instead her expression shifted to something between amusement and disdain.
Oh, Clara, she said with a laugh that sounded more like a bark. Please tell me this isn't actually your engagement ring. It looks like something from a costume jewelry store, the kind of thing they sell to teenagers who want to pretend they're engaged. The words hit me like a physical blow because I hadn't been expecting an attack on something so personal and meaningful. And for a moment, I couldn't think of anything to say in response. Damien leaned over to examine the ring more closely, his expression confirming Sophie's assessment with the kind of smug superiority that made my skin crawl. I hate to agree with Sophie, but she's got a point, he said in the condescending tone of someone who thought his opinion carried more weight than anyone else's feelings. That emerald is obviously synthetic, and the setting looks like something you'd find at a department store jewelry counter. Your boyfriend might be a nice guy, Clara, but he's either cheap or he got taken advantage of by an unscrupulous jeweler. My parents looked uncomfortable and confused, clearly uncertain how to respond to this unexpected attack on something they'd been celebrating just moments before. My mother tried to intervene with a gentle suggestion that the ring was lovely, regardless of its value, but Sophie was just getting started with her character assassination. I mean, I understand that not everyone can afford the kind of ring that actually means something, but surely Ethan could have managed something a little more impressive if he really loved you. This just looks desperate, like he was trying to propose on a shoestring budget and hoping you wouldn't notice the difference. I felt my face burning with embarrassment and anger as Sophie continued her critique, pointing out what she claimed were obvious flaws in the stone and suggesting that any real fiancé would have consulted with her about appropriate engagement ring standards before making such an important purchase. The casual cruelty in her voice was devastating because it was so familiar, the same tone she'd used throughout our childhood whenever she wanted to diminish something I cared about or make me feel small and insignificant. Sophie, that's enough, my father said finally, his voice carrying the authority that had managed unruly teenagers for 30 years. But the damage was already done, and I could see the doubt creeping into my parents' expressions as they looked at my ring with new uncertainty. I'm just being honest, Sophie replied, with the kind of innocent shrug that made her criticism seem like helpful advice rather than deliberate sabotage. Clara deserves to know the truth about what she's accepting, and if Ethan really has the kind of money she claims he does, then this ring is either fake or he's not taking their relationship seriously enough to invest properly in her future. That night, I lay awake staring at my engagement ring in the darkness, Sophie's words echoing in my head despite every rational thought telling me to ignore her jealous commentary. The ring looked the same as it had that morning when I had admired it over my coffee, but somehow her poisonous observations had planted seeds of doubt that I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried to focus on Ethan's love and the genuine emotion in his voice when he'd proposed. The next day at work, I found myself hiding my left hand during meetings, unconsciously covering the ring with my right hand whenever someone might glance at it. And I hated myself for letting Sophie's opinions affect my confidence in something that had made me so happy just 24 hours earlier. During lunch, I even found myself Googling vintage emerald rings and trying to research the difference between natural and synthetic stones, feeling foolish and disloyal for questioning Ethan's choice, but unable to stop myself from seeking reassurance. When Ethan called that evening to ask about my weekend with family, I tried to sound normal and enthusiastic, but he knew me well enough to hear the strain in my voice and immediately asked what was wrong. I wanted to tell him about Sophie's comments and ask for reassurance about the ring's authenticity, but I was afraid of seeming shallow or materialistic, afraid of confirming every stereotype about women who cared more about the size of their diamond than the sincerity of their partner's proposal. Just family drama, I said, which was true if it wasn't the complete truth, and Ethan accepted my explanation with the kind of understanding that made me feel even worse about letting Sophie's comments affect my perception of his gift. But Sophie wasn't finished with her campaign to undermine my happiness and credibility. Over the next few days, she called me twice to share additional thoughts about my engagement ring,
always framing her criticism as concern for my well-being rather than obvious jealousy. She sent me links to articles about how to identify fake gemstones and suggested that I have the ring appraised by an independent jeweler just to be absolutely certain about what I was accepting. "I'm only telling you this because I love you," she said during one particularly painful phone conversation. "But people are going to judge you based on that ring, and if it turns out to be fake, it's going to reflect poorly on both you and Ethan. You deserve better than to be embarrassed by wearing costume jewelry while pretending to be engaged to a successful businessman." The worst part was that Sophie's criticism was spreading beyond our immediate family, through her social media presence and her network of acquaintances who thrived on gossip and drama. She'd posted a photo from our family dinner that included a clear shot of my ring, with a caption that made subtle references to the difference between real and artificial symbols of love. Within hours, the post had generated dozens of comments from her friends offering their own opinions about engagement ring standards and sharing stories about people who'd been deceived by cheap imitations. I knew I should talk to Ethan about what was happening, should trust in our relationship enough to share my concerns and ask for his perspective on Sophie's accusations. But every time I started to bring up the subject, I felt foolish and petty, worried that questioning his choice would make me seem like exactly the kind of materialistic woman he'd tried to avoid in previous relationships. Instead, I found myself pulling back slightly, becoming more reserved in our conversations and less enthusiastic about wedding planning discussions, trying to protect myself from potential embarrassment while simultaneously hating myself for letting Sophie's poison affect the most important relationship in my life. When Ethan noticed my changed behavior and asked if I was having second thoughts about our engagement, I assured him that everything was fine, even though nothing felt fine anymore. The breaking point came when Sophie called to tell me she'd been discussing my situation with Damien and some of his friends in the luxury goods industry, and they'd all agreed that the ring showed clear signs of being a synthetic stone in a cheap setting. She offered to connect me with a gemologist who could provide a professional assessment, framing it as a favor rather than another attack on my fiancé's integrity and my judgment. "I just want you to be happy and confident in your relationship," she said with the kind of false concern that made my stomach turn. "And you can't be truly happy if you're always wondering whether the man you love was honest with you about something this important. Knowledge is power, Clara, and you deserve to know the truth about what you're wearing on your finger." As I hung up the phone, I realized that Sophie had successfully turned what should have been the happiest time of my life into a source of anxiety and shame, and I was furious with myself for letting her manipulation work so effectively. But I was even more furious with her for attacking not just my ring, but my relationship, for trying to plant doubt about Ethan's honesty and commitment based on nothing more than her own jealousy and need to feel superior. That night, I made a decision that would change everything that followed. Instead of continuing to suffer in silence or confronting Sophie directly about her behavior, I decided to tell Ethan exactly what had been happening and let him decide how to respond to these attacks on his character and our relationship. I had no idea that my quiet, humble fiancé had resources and connections that would soon turn Sophie's campaign of whispers and innuendo into the most humiliating experience of her manipulative life. The conversation with Ethan that changed everything happened on a Thursday evening when he'd planned a quiet dinner at his apartment, and I could see the concern in his eyes as I fidgeted with my engagement ring throughout the meal, unconsciously twisting it around my finger in the nervous habit I'd developed over the past week. When he finally asked what was really bothering me, all the words I'd been holding back came pouring out in a rush of frustration and embarrassment that left me feeling exposed and vulnerable. I told him about Sophie's comments at the family dinner, about her social media campaign questioning the authenticity of the ring, and about the growing whispers among her network of status-conscious friends who seemed to take perverse pleasure in dissecting other people's relationships based on material displays of wealth. I explained how our constant criticism had made me doubt not just the ring, but everything I thought I knew about our relationship, and how ashamed I felt for letting Sophie's poison affect something so precious to me. Ethan listened to everything without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail I shared about Sophie's systematic campaign to undermine our engagement.
When I finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ring on my finger with an intensity that made me wonder if I had made a terrible mistake by revealing my doubts. Clara, he said finally, his voice carrying a cold anger I'd never heard before. That ring belonged to my great-grandmother Helena Ward, who received it from her husband in 1924 when he struck oil in Texas and became one of the wealthiest men in the Southwest. The emerald is a 5-carat Colombian stone that was personally selected by Cartier, and the setting is handcrafted platinum with VS1 diamonds. The ring was appraised last year at $450,000. Not that its monetary value matters compared to what it represents in our family history. The numbers hit me like a physical blow because they were so far beyond anything I had imagined, and suddenly Sophie's confident assertions about synthetic stones and cheap settings revealed themselves as the ignorant jealousy they'd always been. But Ethan wasn't finished with his explanation, and what he told me next made Sophie's behavior seem even more calculated and malicious. More importantly, he continued, your sister has been spreading rumors about my financial situation and business practices to anyone who will listen, claiming that I'm running some kind of elaborate con to win over a successful woman by pretending to have money I don't possess. She's been telling people that my company is failing, that I'm facing bankruptcy, and that I'm using you for your connections in the marketing industry. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized that the scope of Sophie's campaign went far beyond attacking my ring, and that she'd been actively trying to destroy Ethan's reputation while positioning herself as the caring sister trying to protect me from a fortune hunter. The calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking because she knew exactly how sensitive I was about being used for professional advancement, having experienced that disappointment in previous relationships. How do you know all this? I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer given Ethan's resources and connections in the business world.
Because I have people who monitor online chatter about my company and personal life, he said with a matter-of-fact tone of someone accustomed to managing his public image. It's necessary when you're in my position to know what rumors are circulating and where they're coming from, especially when they could affect business relationships or family security. The implications of what he was telling me began to sink in as I realized that Sophie's whisper campaign wasn't just hurting our relationship, but potentially damaging Ethan's professional reputation among people who might not know him well enough to dismiss obvious lies. For someone in his position, even unfounded rumors could have serious consequences if they reached the wrong ears or gained enough momentum to seem credible. What are you going to do? I asked, though I was beginning to understand that Ethan hadn't built a $3 billion company by allowing people to spread malicious lies about him without consequences. I'm going to stop it, he said simply. But first, I want to make sure you're prepared for what that means. When I respond to attacks on my character or my family, I don't do it halfway. Your sister has crossed a line that I take very seriously, and she's about to learn that actions have consequences, even when you think you're untouchable. Over the next few days, I watched Ethan transform from the gentle, understated man I'd fallen in love with into someone who radiated the kind of quiet power that came from having unlimited resources and the willingness to use them strategically. He made phone calls in languages I didn't recognize, reviewed documents that his assistant delivered to the apartment at all hours, and held video conferences with people whose titles suggested they specialized in reputation management and legal warfare. I want you to understand something, he told me, during one of these preparation sessions, looking up from a tablet filled with what appeared to be comprehensive research on Sophie's life and activities. I'm not doing this out of spite, or because my ego was bruised by some jealous comments. I'm doing this because your sister has crossed the line from petty family drama into defamation that could affect my business and endanger people who depend on my company for their livelihoods. He showed me printouts of social media posts and forum discussions where Sophie had escalated her claims beyond questioning my ring to spreading detailed lies about Ethan's financial situation, his business practices, and even suggestions that he might be involved in illegal activities.
What had started as jealous commentary about engagement ring standards had morphed into a coordinated campaign to destroy his reputation among influential people in her social circle. "She's been talking to reporters," Ethan continued, his voice carrying the controlled fury of someone who'd built his success on careful privacy management. "She's trying to plant stories about my alleged financial problems and your supposed ignorance about being deceived by a con artist." The revelation that Sophie had taken her campaign to the media made me feel sick because I knew she understood exactly how damaging that kind of publicity could be for someone in Ethan's position. She wasn't just trying to hurt our relationship anymore. She was trying to destroy his career and reputation out of pure spite and jealousy. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "There's something else you need to know," Ethan said, pulling up another document on his tablet. "Sophie's boyfriend Damien has been using these rumors to benefit his own business dealings, telling potential clients that he has inside information about my company's financial instability and suggesting they invest with him instead of considering partnerships with Sentinel Security." The scope of the conspiracy was larger than I'd imagined, extending beyond personal attacks into actual business interference that could affect Ethan's company and employees. What Sophie had started as jealous criticism of my engagement ring had evolved into a criminal enterprise designed to destroy someone's reputation and livelihood. "What exactly are you planning to do about it?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand that Ethan's response would be proportional to the attack and devastating in its precision. "I'm planning to give your sister exactly what she's been asking for," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "She wants to know about my real financial situation and business capabilities. She's about to get a very thorough education in both."
The engagement party invitation arrived at my parents' house on cream-colored cardstock with elegant script that announced a celebration in honor of Clara Benson and Ethan Ward to be held at the Fairmont Copley Plaza Hotel in Boston's Back Bay. The formal nature of the invitation was already a departure from the casual gathering we'd originally planned. But when I read the guest list Ethan had prepared, I realized this wasn't going to be a typical family celebration. 200 people? I asked, when he showed me the comprehensive list that included not just our families and close friends, but also tech industry leaders, government officials, major investors, and media figures whose presence would turn our engagement party into a significant social and business event. "Your sister wanted to make our relationship a public spectacle," Ethan replied, with the calm satisfaction of someone whose plans were falling perfectly into place. "I thought we should give her the platform she's been seeking to share her opinions about my character and financial situation with a much larger audience than she's been reaching through social media." I could see the strategic brilliance in his approach, because Sophie would never be able to resist the opportunity to attend such a high-profile event, especially one where she could continue her campaign of whispered innuendo among people who might actually have influence and connections she valued. But I also understood that she would be walking into a situation where every lie she'd told would be exposed in front of witnesses who could destroy her credibility permanently. "She'll bring Damien," I said, thinking about how my sister's boyfriend would react to being in a room full of people whose wealth and influence made his own success seem modest by comparison. "I'm counting on it," Ethan said, showing me a second page of the guest list that included several of Damien's business rivals and potential clients who would be very interested to learn about his role in spreading false information about a major industry player. "He's been using lies about my company to win contracts and investment deals. It's time for his clients to hear the truth about his business practices and ethics."
The week leading up to the party was a masterclass in strategic planning as Ethan's team prepared what he called a comprehensive response to months of defamation and business interference. I watched lawyers review evidence, publicists coordinate with friendly journalists, and investigators compile detailed reports on Sophie and Damien's activities that would make their lies impossible to sustain under scrutiny. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I asked the night before the party, suddenly concerned about the collateral damage that might affect my relationship with my parents and the long-term consequences of such a public confrontation with my sister. "Clara," Ethan said, taking my hands and looking at me with the kind of intensity that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. "Your sister has spent months trying to convince people that you're naive and I'm a fraud. Tomorrow night, everyone who matters in this industry is going to see exactly who we really are and what we're capable of building together. She asked for the truth about my wealth and business success. She's about to get more truth than she can handle." As I went to bed that night, I thought about Sophie's confidence and arrogance, about her absolute certainty that she could attack someone's character and reputation without facing any consequences for her actions. Tomorrow, she would learn that some people have resources and connections that make them dangerous to cross, and that jealousy and spite are poor weapons against facts and legal power. The ring on my finger caught the light from the bedside lamp, and for the first time in weeks, I saw it clearly for what it had always been, not just a beautiful piece of jewelry, but a symbol of love from someone with the wisdom to value authenticity over appearance and the strength to protect what he cherished from those who would destroy it out of envy.
Followed behind her in a suit that screamed expensive but lacked the subtle tailoring that marked real quality, his expression cycling between awe at the guest list and calculation as he spotted potential business targets. I watched Sophie's face as she took in the scope of the event, her confident smile faltering slightly as she realized that this wasn't the modest family gathering she'd been expecting to dominate with her usual performance of superior knowledge and sophisticated taste. Her eyes swept the room, cataloging familiar faces from magazine covers and news articles, and I could see the exact moment when she understood that she was completely out of her depth. "My God, Clara," Sophie said when she finally reached us, her voice carrying a forced brightness that didn't quite mask her shock at finding herself in a room full of genuinely important people. "This is quite the production. Ethan certainly knows how to put on a show." "Thank you," Ethan replied with perfect politeness, though I could hear the steel underneath his gracious tone. "I wanted to make sure all our friends and colleagues had the chance to celebrate with us and meet the woman who's made me so happy." Damien stepped forward with the kind of aggressive confidence that worked in his usual circles, but seemed juvenile among guests who wielded real influence without needing to announce it. "Impressive turnout," he said, scanning the room with obvious hunger for networking opportunities. "I recognize quite a few potential clients and investors." "I'm sure you do," Ethan said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "In fact, I believe several of them are people you've been in contact with recently about business opportunities." Something in his tone made Damien's expression shift from confidence to wariness, though he was still too arrogant to recognize the trap that was closing around him. "Always looking for new partnerships," he said with a laugh that sounded forced. "That's how you build an empire, right?" "Absolutely," Ethan agreed, "which is why I'm sure they'll be fascinated to hear about your recent marketing strategies and the information you've been sharing about my company's financial situation." The confrontation began during the toast portion of the evening when Ethan took the microphone and began what sounded like a traditional speech, thanking guests for their presence and celebrating our engagement. But as he continued speaking, his words took on a different tone that made the room fall silent with the kind of attention that comes when powerful people sense drama unfolding. "As many of you know," Ethan said, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom's excellent sound system, "Clara and I have faced some interesting challenges during our engagement, particularly from family members who questioned the authenticity of our relationship and the sincerity of my commitment to the woman I love." I could see Sophie's face changing color as she realized that Ethan was about to address her campaign of lies in front of an audience that included everyone whose opinion she valued.
Damien looked equally uncomfortable, finally beginning to understand that this elegant party might not be the networking opportunity he'd anticipated. Some people have suggested that my financial situation isn't what it appears to be, and that I might be deceiving Clara about my ability to provide for her future. Others have gone even further, spreading rumors about my business practices and suggesting that my company might be facing bankruptcy or legal troubles. The room was completely silent now, except for the sound of glasses being quietly set down on tables as guests realized they were about to witness something unprecedented. I could see Margaret Chen discreetly taking notes, while other journalists in attendance activated recording devices with the practiced efficiency of people who recognized a major story developing. I thought this might be an appropriate time to address these concerns directly, he said, nodding to someone at the back of the room. Victoria Lane, my chief legal counsel, has prepared a comprehensive response to these allegations that I think you'll all find illuminating. Victoria Lane strode onto the small stage with the kind of presence that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. Her tailored suit and cold smile suggested that she was someone who dismantled lies for a living and enjoyed her work. She carried a tablet and a folder thick with documents, and when she began speaking, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to courtrooms and boardrooms where truth mattered more than charm. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria said, her words crisp and professional, "over the past 3 months, Mr. Ward's reputation management team has been tracking a systematic campaign of defamation originating from specific individuals who have spread false information about his financial status, business practices, and personal character." She gestured to the large screen that had descended behind her, which now displayed screenshots of social media posts, forum discussions, and even email communications that showed the scope of Sophie's campaign in devastating detail. Every lie was documented with timestamps and context that made the malicious intent impossible to deny. These individuals have claimed that Mr. Ward's company is facing bankruptcy, when in fact, Sentinel Security Systems reported record profits of $1.2 billion last quarter and holds contracts with 14 national governments and over 60 Fortune 500 companies. The numbers landed like bombs in the silent room, and I could see several guests turning to look at Sophie and Damien with expressions of shock and disgust. The revelation of Ethan's actual success made their campaign of lies seem not just malicious, but spectacularly stupid. They have suggested that Miss Benson's engagement ring is costume jewelry, Victoria said, her voice taking on a tone of amused contempt, when in fact it is a certified 5-carat Colombian emerald in a platinum and diamond setting created by Cartier in 1924, currently appraised at $450,000 and insured through Lloyd's of London.
People. Screenshots showed her contacting journalists with false stories, messaging potential business contacts of Damien's with fabricated information about Ethan's financial troubles, and even attempting to plant questions about our relationship with society reporters who covered engagement announcements. Most seriously, Victoria continued, her voice taking on the prosecutorial tone that had made her reputation in corporate litigation, Mr. Damien Cross has used these false rumors to interfere with legitimate business relationships, telling potential clients that he possessed inside information about Sentinel Securities' instability and suggesting they invest with his company instead. The evidence she presented was overwhelming and devastating, showing not just the scope of their lies, but the criminal intent behind using defamation for business advantage. Email communications displayed on the screen showed Damien explicitly using Sophie's rumors to win contracts by spreading fear about Ethan's financial stability. As of this morning, Victoria announced with the satisfaction of someone delivering a checkmate, Mr. Cross's business license has been suspended pending investigation by the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office for fraudulent business practices, and Miss Sophie Benson is facing civil litigation for defamation with damages currently estimated at $15 million. The room erupted in whispers and shocked exclamations as guests processed the implications of what they had just witnessed.
Sophie looked like she was going to faint, her face completely drained of color, as she realized that her jealous campaign had destroyed not just her reputation, but potentially her entire future. Damien was frantically checking his phone, probably discovering that his business accounts had been frozen and his clients were already distancing themselves from association with his fraudulent practices. "The lesson here," Ethan said, retaking the microphone as Victoria gathered her evidence with professional efficiency, "is that truth has a way of emerging, even when people work very hard to obscure it with lies and manipulation. Clara and I are grateful to everyone who stood by us during this difficult period, and we look forward to building our future together without the distraction of people who mistake jealousy for insight and..." The engagement ring on my finger caught the light from the chandeliers, and for the first time since Sophie's attack began, I saw it clearly for what it had always been. Not just a symbol of love, but a connection to a family history of strength and success that some people would never understand because they were too busy looking for shortcuts and advantages that didn't require actual character or integrity. 6 months after the engagement party that became legendary in Boston social circles, for all the wrong reasons from Sophie's perspective, I was sitting in the sunroom of Ethan's Beacon Hill mansion reviewing wedding invitations when my mother called to update me on my sister's latest attempt to rebuild her shattered life. The conversation was painful but necessary, a monthly ritual we'd established to maintain some connection to Sophie, while acknowledging that our relationship had been fundamentally changed by her campaign of lies and the devastating consequences that followed. The wedding planning process had become a strange mixture of joy and vindication, as vendors who had initially seemed hesitant to work with us suddenly became extremely accommodating once word spread about Ethan's actual resources and influence. The florist who had originally suggested we consider a more modest budget called to offer exclusive access to rare orchids flown in from Ecuador. The caterer who had seemed skeptical about our guest list now proposed custom menus featuring ingredients that required months of advance ordering. And the photographer whose initial quote had seemed astronomical suddenly seemed reasonable given the caliber of guests who would be attending. "I keep thinking about that night," I told my assistant coordinator as we reviewed seating charts that read like a who's who of technology and government leadership, about how different everything could have been if Sophie had just been happy for me instead of trying to tear down what Ethan and I were building together. The engagement party had transformed from what was supposed to be a celebration into a masterclass in strategic reputation management, and the aftermath had rippled through social and business circles in ways that continued to surprise me. Margaret Chen had written a feature article about the evening that became one of the most read pieces in TechCrunch history, focusing on the importance of factual reporting and the dangers of spreading unverified rumors about industry leaders. Several other journalists had used the incident as a cautionary tale about the ethics of gossip-based reporting and the legal consequences of publishing defamatory content without proper verification. "She's moved back to Los Angeles," my mother said, with the weary tone of someone who had spent months trying to understand how one daughter could systematically try to destroy the other's happiness out of pure jealousy. "She's working as a hostess at some restaurant in West Hollywood, sharing an apartment with 3 other girls because she can't afford to live alone anymore. The legal bills from the defamation case have taken everything she had saved, and most of the settlement money from the trust fund your grandmother had left her." I felt a complex mix of emotions hearing about Sophie's reduced circumstances because while I was satisfied that she was finally facing consequences for her actions, I also remembered the sister who had once been my closest companion before jealousy and materialism had poisoned her into someone I barely recognized. The $15 million judgment had been reduced to $2 million in the final settlement, but even that amount had been enough to destroy the lifestyle she'd built around appearances and social climbing. The transformation in my own life had been equally dramatic but in the opposite direction, as doors that had previously been closed suddenly opened when people understood Ethan's actual position in the technology industry. Business leaders who had never returned my calls were now inviting me to serve on nonprofit boards. Universities were asking me to speak at commencement ceremonies about entrepreneurship and ethics, and investment firms were offering me consulting positions that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. The irony, I told my mother during one of these conversations, is that Sophie's attack actually ended up elevating my profile and career in ways I never could have achieved on my own. The people who witnessed Ethan's defense of our relationship now see me as someone worthy of their respect and attention, while Sophie has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting jealousy override basic decency. The wedding planning had also become an education in the kinds of decisions that come with marrying someone whose wealth operates on a completely different scale than anything I'd previously experienced. Every choice, from the venue to the guest list, carried implications that extended far beyond personal preference into business relationships and social obligations that I was still learning to navigate with Ethan's patient guidance. How is she handling it? I asked, genuinely curious about whether the experience had taught her anything about the value of honesty and hard work, or whether she was simply bitter about being caught and held accountable for her choices. She's angry, my mother admitted, with the kind of exhausted honesty that comes from months of trying to be supportive while acknowledging ugly truths about your own child. Angry at you, angry at Ethan, angry at the legal system, angry at everyone except herself for the choices that led to this situation. She keeps saying that the punishment didn't fit the crime, that it was just family drama that got blown out of proportion by people with too much money and power. The complete lack of remorse or self-reflection in Sophie's response wasn't surprising, but it was disappointing because it meant she hadn't learned anything meaningful from the experience beyond the fact that some people couldn't be attacked without serious consequences. She still saw herself as the victim of unfair treatment rather than someone who had deliberately tried to destroy two people's lives and reputations for personal satisfaction. What made her attitude even more frustrating was the way she continued to minimize the scope of her actions, describing them as harmless family teasing rather than the systematic campaign of defamation that had required months of planning and coordination. The evidence Victoria Lane had presented at the engagement party showed dozens of emails, social media posts, and phone conversations where Sophie had spread increasingly elaborate lies about Ethan's character and business practices, always careful to frame her attacks as concerned observations from someone with inside knowledge. She actually asked me last week if you thought you and Ethan might be willing to help with her legal bills, my mother continued with the embarrassed tone of someone delivering a message they knew was inappropriate. She said that since you were family, you should understand that she never intended for things to go so far and that she's learned her lesson about spreading rumors. The audacity of Sophie asking for financial help from the people she'd tried to destroy was breathtaking in its complete lack of self-awareness, and it confirmed everything I'd come to understand about her character over the past year. Even facing bankruptcy and social ostracization, she still believed that family obligations should protect her from the consequences of her actions and that we should prioritize her comfort over justice or accountability. And Damien? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer based on the kind of man who would abandon ship at the first sign of real trouble. Gone, the day after his business license was suspended, my mother said with bitter satisfaction. Apparently, his commitment to Sophie wasn't strong enough to survive financial hardship and public embarrassment. She hasn't heard from him since he cleared out his things while she was meeting with lawyers about the defamation case. The revelation that Damien had abandoned Sophie the moment his own interests were threatened was perfectly consistent with the shallow opportunism he'd displayed throughout their relationship, using her as a social accessory while she was useful and discarding her when association became a liability. It was a harsh lesson about the difference between relationships built on mutual attraction to wealth and status versus genuine love and partnership. The contrast with my own relationship couldn't have been starker, because Ethan's response to Sophie's attack had been to defend our partnership with every resource at his disposal, rather than distancing himself to protect his reputation. When I had worried that the family drama might damage his standing in business circles, he'd made it clear that anyone who would judge him based on his fiance's sister's behavior wasn't someone whose opinion mattered to him anyway. I know you probably don't want to hear this, my mother continued with the hesitant tone of someone approaching a subject that had caused months of family tension. But I think about what happened to Sophie, and I wonder if we could have handled things differently. If there was some way to address her behavior without destroying her life so completely. The question hung between us like a challenge because it touched on something I'd been wrestling with since the engagement party when I watched my sister's world crumble in real time. While I was satisfied that justice had been served and that Sophie had finally faced consequences for her malicious behavior, I also understood that Ethan's response had been designed to be overwhelming and permanent rather than educational or redemptive. During my own therapy sessions that had become necessary to process the complex emotions surrounding Sophie's betrayal and downfall, Dr. Martinez had helped me understand that my guilt about her situation was a normal response to seeing someone I'd once loved facing severe consequences, even when those consequences were entirely deserved. The child in me that remembered building blanket forts with Sophie and sharing secrets late at night still mourned the loss of that relationship, even while the adult in me recognized that the sister I'd loved had been replaced by someone capable of breathtaking cruelty.
Mom, I said carefully, choosing my words with the precision I'd learned from watching Ethan navigate complex business negotiations. Sophie didn't just make a few jealous comments about my ring. She spent months spreading lies about Ethan's character and business practices to journalists and potential clients, trying to damage his reputation and interfere with his company's operations. What happened to her wasn't revenge, it was the natural consequence of attacking someone who had the resources and determination to defend himself. I could hear my mother sighing on the other end of the line, and I knew she was struggling with the cognitive dissonance of loving a daughter whose behavior had been genuinely destructive, while also wanting to believe that there might have been a gentler way to address the situation. But the truth was that Sophie had escalated her campaign far beyond family drama, into actual business interference and potential criminal activity. I understand that, my mother said finally, but sometimes I look at what your life has become and what hers has become, and the contrast is so stark that it feels almost cruel. You're living in a mansion, planning a wedding that will probably cost more than most people's houses, while she's struggling to pay rent and working a job that barely covers her basic expenses. The comparison was valid, but incomplete, because it focused on our current circumstances rather than the choices and values that had led us to such different places. Sophie had spent years chasing shortcuts to wealth and status through relationships and manipulation, while I had built my success through education, hard work, and the kind of authentic partnership that could survive external challenges. What my mother didn't fully understand was how the experience of being attacked by Sophie had actually strengthened my relationship with Ethan, rather than weakening it, forcing us to communicate more openly about our values and priorities while demonstrating our mutual commitment to defending what we'd built together. The crisis had revealed character on both sides. Sophie's willingness to destroy others for personal satisfaction, and Ethan's determination to protect the people he loved from malicious attacks. The difference isn't luck or unfairness, I said, feeling the need to defend not just my own choices, but the principles that had guided them. The difference is that I worked for what I have and built relationships based on mutual respect and genuine compatibility, while Sophie tried to take shortcuts through deception and manipulation. What happened to her wasn't cruel, it was educational, even if she's choosing not to learn from it. After I hung up with my mother, I found myself walking through the house that would soon officially become my home, thinking about the journey that had brought me from a middle-class family in suburban Massachusetts to engagement with one of the most successful entrepreneurs of our generation. Every room contained evidence of Ethan's success and sophistication, from the original artwork that covered the walls to the first edition books that filled his library, but also signs of the values and character that had made him successful in the first place.
The transformation in my perspective had been as dramatic as any external change, as I'd learned to see wealth not as something to be guilty about or apologetic for, but as a tool that could be used responsibly to create positive change in the world. Ethan's foundation work had introduced me to the ways that strategic philanthropy could address systemic problems rather than just treating symptoms, and I'd begun to understand that privilege carried both opportunities and obligations that required careful consideration. The study where he worked contained degrees from MIT and Harvard, but also photographs of the scholarship recipients supported by his foundation and letters from students whose educations had been funded by his commitment to giving back. The living room showcased expensive furniture and decorative objects, but also family photographs that traced generations of Ward family achievement through business innovation and philanthropic leadership. When Ethan returned from his afternoon meetings, he found me in the garden behind the house, sitting on the stone bench where he'd first told me about his family history and the responsibilities that came with wealth and influence. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the perfectly maintained landscape, and I was twisting my engagement ring around my finger in the nervous habit I'd developed during Sophie's campaign of lies. "Thinking about your sister?" he asked, settling beside me with the intuitive understanding that had characterized our relationship from the beginning. He'd heard enough of my phone conversations with family members to know that Sophie's situation remained a source of complex emotions despite my satisfaction with the justice that had been served. "Do you regret how things played out with Sophie? Do you wish we'd handled her campaign differently?" The question forced me to examine my own feelings honestly, to separate my natural sympathy for family members in distress from my assessment of whether justice had been properly served. While I felt sorry for the circumstances Sophie now faced, I couldn't honestly say that I regretted the exposure of her lies or the consequences that had followed. The wedding planning process had also shown me how Sophie's attack had actually elevated my standing in certain circles, as people who had witnessed Ethan's defense of our relationship
now viewed me as someone worthy of their respect and attention. Business leaders who had never returned my calls were now inviting me to serve on nonprofit boards. Universities were asking me to speak at commencement ceremonies, and investment firms were offering consulting positions that would have been unimaginable before the engagement party. "I regret that she made choices that led to such a destructive confrontation," I said carefully. "But I don't regret that you defended our relationship and your reputation against someone who was trying to destroy both." Sophie had multiple opportunities to stop her campaign and apologize for the lie she'd spread, but she chose to escalate instead of taking responsibility for her behavior. The garden around us was beginning to show signs of the approaching spring that would bring our wedding, with early crocuses pushing through the soil and the first buds appearing on the cherry trees that would be in full bloom for our ceremony. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. New growth emerging from what had seemed like dormant ground, beauty and life persisting despite the harsh winter that had preceded them. We sat in comfortable silence as the sun continued to set, both of us thinking about the complex dynamics of family relationships and the difficult balance between loyalty and accountability. The engagement ring on my finger caught the light filtering through the garden's ancient oak trees, and I found myself remembering the moment when Ethan had first placed it there and promised to love and protect me for the rest of our lives. "There's something I want to show you," Ethan said, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket with the kind of ceremonial care that suggested this was a moment he'd been planning carefully. "Something I've been saving for the right time to give you." Inside the box was a pair of emerald earrings that perfectly matched my engagement ring, with the same deep green stones and platinum setting that spoke to decades of careful craftsmanship and family tradition. A small card tucked beneath the earrings explained that they had belonged to his great-grandmother Helena Ward and were traditionally given to Ward family brides as a wedding gift from their future husbands. "They're beautiful," I whispered, touched by the gesture and the family history it represented, but also by the symbolism of being welcomed into a legacy of love and partnership that had endured for generations.
"They're yours now," Ethan said, helping me put them on with the gentle precision of someone who understood that jewelry was meaningful not for its monetary value, but for the relationships and commitments it represented. Along with everything else that comes with marrying into this family, the responsibilities, the expectations, and the absolute certainty that I will always defend what we've built together against anyone who tries to tear it down. As we walked back to the house together, I thought about the wedding we were planning for the following spring and the life we would build together afterward. Sophie's attack had taught us both valuable lessons about the importance of protecting what we valued and responding decisively to threats against our happiness and reputation. But it had also shown us the strength of our partnership when facing external challenges. The emerald earrings felt substantial and beautiful against my neck, a tangible reminder that I was marrying not just an individual, but joining a family tradition of success and integrity that stretched back generations. Whatever challenges we might face in the future, I knew that we would meet them together with the same combination of love, wisdom, and strategic thinking that had allowed us to survive Sophie's campaign and emerge stronger than before. The house welcomed us back with warm light spilling from every window, a symbol of the home we were building together and the future we would create through mutual respect, genuine partnership, and the kind of authentic love that could withstand any attempt to destroy it through jealousy, manipulation, or spite.